we can get started. Welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas, the I Am The Cavalry track. This is
Jessica, go first.
Fed's Heart Hackers with Allan Friedman, who said he was a failed academic who went into government. And then we have Suzanne Schwartz and Jessica Wilkerson still with us, and Bo Wood still with us. If you have a cell phone, please mute or turn off the cell phone so we don't annoy all the people around you. These talks are being recorded, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the handheld mic over for you so that everybody on the whole internet gets to hear your wonderful thoughts. And of course, we need to thank our sponsors, and our stellar sponsors are Verisprite, Protivity, Tenable, Amazon, and Source of Knowledge. And with that, welcome our speakers.
All right, welcome back. We've got a very good, very distinguished panel of folks here from government. The title of this session is called Fed's Heart Hackers, and I think in the last session we saw that at least one Fed hearts hackers. In this one, we will see that many, many more Feds heart hackers, and they represent very diverse groups, very diverse perspectives and points of view. And yet all of them have been intimately involved, and there's several other people in the room who have been intimately involved in hearting a hacker or hugging a hacker and getting more of the security research community ethos, ideas, and people into some of the discussions that intimately affect national security, the U.S. economy, through cybersecurity. So I'll ask each of the panelists to very briefly introduce themselves for the new group and the new session film, because they won't have heard your voices yet before, maybe. And maybe we'll start with Allan down on the end, standing in the back, because we ran out of chairs for this session, because you love it so much.
I think that's fantastic that we have so many people in the session that we stole chairs from the panel so that the audience can sit. I think that's the way it should be. My name is Allan. I used to do crypto. I wasn't very good at it. I got a PhD in applied economics. I wasn't very good at that. I postdoced and thought about computational modeling. I wasn't very good at that. When you're mediocre at that many things, you end up in Washington, D.C. And so after spending time bouncing around think tank land and universities, I got convinced into joining government. So I work for NTIA, which is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. We're part of the Department of Commerce. We are the president's advisor on internet policy. If anyone has heard of ICANN, we were involved in stabilizing global internet governance, but we also think a lot about basically creating a free, open, and trustworthy internet that is stable and sustainable moving forward. And so the work we do at NTIA is to promote a overall trusted digital ecosystem.
Thank you. And I am Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA. I, first of all, want to say that I have the great privilege of working with both folks on either side of me, as well as with I Am The Cavalry. I am a physician by training. I came to the FDA in 2010. It'll be 7 years in October. And one might ask, what is a clinician doing in the area of medical device cybersecurity, or how did I get into that? First of all, I am the Associate Director for Science and Strategic Partnerships at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. For those of you who may not be familiar with FDA, FDA has multiple centers, and specifically multiple product centers. Of the different medical product centers, Center for Devices is the center that is responsible for overseeing and regulating medical devices. And through a very interesting, somewhat circuitous way, I became involved in medical device cybersecurity as part of my larger portfolio. And it has been a very exciting, challenging journey, and one which I think Jessica, in her earlier remarks in the previous session, you really teed us up well at FDA for a lot of the work that we've been doing, which really speaks to these themes of really trying to promote collaboration, incentivize, and bring Thank you. And bring stakeholders to the table so that all the voices can be heard in terms of really bringing expertise, technical expertise, subject matter expertise, clinical expertise, security expertise, policy expertise, everything together as part of solving what is a collective, very, very challenging problem.
Yeah, so I think, like Allan and Suzanne said, I have the immense privilege of working with them very closely on these issues. Part of it is because they both fall under my committee's jurisdiction, which is very fun. But part of it is just that, they're amazing people doing amazing things, and I rely pretty heavily on the work that they're doing to be able to do mine. So my name is Jessica Wilkerson. For those of you who are not here for the previous panel, I work on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce covering our cybersecurity portfolio. So for those of you who don't know, House Energy and Commerce has one of the largest jurisdictions in the United States Congress. We oversee healthcare, energy, telecommunications, commercial issues. Almost any issue you can think of, we probably have some hook into. It's fun, but it also means that every time there's a cybersecurity issue in just about anything, I get a panicked phone call or email. And so, I think we had been talking about the collaboration between, the research community and technical issues and industry and government. And I think one of the things that I would use to kick off the panel for me, when I was saying that I get a panicked phone call or a panicked email every time a big cybersecurity issue happens, my response is always two things. Who's the government agency I need to call? And who's the security researcher or expert who knows the most about this issue? They're my first two calls, and then I go out from there. So that I think for me is one of the biggest components of why I'm here and talking about this topic.
All right, great, thank you. So I do have the privilege of having three awesome teammates here with us who've been, I think, Allan, we've known each other for many years before I came to DC. Suzanne, you and I met at the Atlantic Council event in 2015, maybe? I think this may have even been before your first workshop. Yeah, could have been. Yeah. And then Jessica and I met a couple of years ago, and throughout the last few years, certainly on the cavalry journey, but even preceding it, they've done tremendous work helping to bring security researchers into government and have their voices be heard in some of those discussions where traditionally we haven't had a place at the table. And under the principle of least governance is best governance, or the government that governs least governs best, I want these three to have an active discussion and talk about some of their journey, kind of finding out that security researchers were friends, not adversaries, to some of their work in government, and what the transition has been like over the past few years. So I don't know who wants to start first, but I'll just throw it over to the three of you.
Suzanne, you have
Yeah, sure.
cut.
So it has been a very interesting journey, and one where we've learned a lot at the FDA and really broadly speaking within our entire healthcare community, because if you go back even to 2013, into that time frame, the medical device industry and the healthcare delivery organizations as well really were just beginning to start to see a lot of the concerns emerge around security of medical devices. And on many fronts, this was really kind of a wake-up call, not just to the community, to all of the users of devices, whether they're, again, within hospitals as well as on the manufacturing side, but for the FDA also. Devices have been notoriously, as they're regulated for what's considered to be safety and effectiveness. And the very notion that one might be able to exploit a device and, as a result of that, cause some kind of potential consequence, whether it's a patient safety harm or otherwise, the very idea of wrapping one's head around that possibility, very, very, very difficult for, I think, folks who work within the healthcare sector to begin with. A sector that is very much driven by this idea of helping the public, benefiting the public. Who would ever do such a thing? So to start with, there was a need for a significant culture shift that would occur, that would need to occur. And in order to get to that place, you really had to start with creating a better and a very basic understanding, a foundational understanding of what exists, first of all, within the broader universe, what researchers have been able to identify, what's happening well outside of healthcare, how do we need to really understand or think about things differently, and this comes back down to not viewing each other as adversaries. And it's not just merely adversaries, I guess, among researchers and manufacturers, but frankly speaking, what we were seeing at the agency was a lot of tension between healthcare organizations and manufacturers as well. And so there's a lot of conflict and a lot of really needing to bring all of the stakeholders to the table to recognize, to discuss what are the pain points, what are the challenges that we're seeing, how can we as a community, that kind of collaborative, collective, come together. But it is through being able to articulate what are the issues that one is seeing and how are we going to get to a point of being able to kind of parse out, and analyze these problem sets and get to a place that is going to be a much more satisfactory and a much more mature place. So in this, and it's a long-winded answer, but in this journey over the past few years, a lot of what we've been doing is being able to draw in the community. It is that convening power. So as a regulatory agency, we don't only regulate. Actually, most of what we end up doing that is probably powerful is in terms of really bringing people together and convening through public workshops, public meetings, other kinds of roundtable discussions and summits as well, to get expertise, to get perspective. And I think that that's an important word to use here as well, to understand what is it like to be standing in the other stakeholders' shoes and have to deal with what it is that they're dealing with, and how do we learn together. So a lot of it has been a learning journey for all of us, to the extent that I think I said this perhaps even last year, although when I was here last year, our guidance, the post-market wasn't finalized, now it is. But I don't think our guidance would be as robust as it is had it not been for the fact that we really needed to, and it was important for us to bring together all the diverse members of the community, all the different stakeholders in terms of informing what would be appropriate as approaches, what might not work, what is feasible, what's not feasible, what might be a better way to go. And it was through that collective and being able to take into account a lot of that counsel that I think we're in a better place than we were, a year ago.
So Suzanne used the word stakeholder, and a duck dropped out of the ceiling. So you talk about the role of convening, and of course Jessica talked a lot about that on the last panel, and that is in fact the primary tool that we have at NTIA. We are not a regulator. The Department of Commerce, I joined the Department of Commerce and said, proudly, we're not a regulator, and then Wassenaar happened. So let's leave export control aside, and also we regulate fish. But other than fish and dual-use technology, we're not a regulator. And we like it when markets work. And a lot of our mission is to say, hey, when there are flaws in the market, what can we do to bring them on track? And may I talk for a moment about the work that you've done, just because I think it was very relevant to what Ali said this morning about economics and thinking about the overall system. Which is what I love about the FDA as a regulator. We don't hate regulators, we just hate regulation. But we love our friendly regulators. And I think what the FDA did is they reframed the problem to make security the easy and positive direction from an incentives perspective. And I just love this approach. Rather than security being something that we impose, you must do this. You think about, compliance. Everyone loves compliance in this room, right? They basically said, hey, listen, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to treat safety and security. We're going to draw a distinction between them, and I'll let you talk more about that. But saying if there is a security flaw and you've already built an organization that can fix it, and then you fix it, it's not quite a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's pretty close from a lawyer's perspective, right? Your risk officer would treat it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And so it really aligns all the incentives to say, let me start thinking about security now, because if/when something happens, I know that it's going to go better, and it communicates at a very high level. And a lot of what we try to do at NTIA is to understand what that dynamic is. You can't impose security, right? The beatings will continue until the code quality improves is not something that really flows in a lot of directions. And even if we are going to use very strong incentives, positive or negative, a lot of what makes policy effective is to make the right thing to do the easiest thing to do. And it's to enable the people whose behavior we're trying to change to do the right thing. So we talked about convening. A couple of years ago when I joined government, one of the first issues I wanted to tackle was disclosure. This has been a fight that the security community has been having for 20 years. I think when I announced that the US government wanted to look at this, I gave a couple of people in this room PTSD. Some of them were very, very patient. Some of them were not, but most of them were very, very patient and said, hey, it's very clear, here's what to avoid. I had to work very hard to convince my colleagues in government that we wanted to avoid the term best practices for this particular issue. But I think, yes, responsible disclosure, we tried to... Who knew that hackers believed in political correctness when it came to their words? Right? We try to avoid responsible disclosure. Now it's coordinated disclosure, and so we framed it around collaboration. But it was this convening that I think was really important, of bringing companies that had been fighting with hackers for a while into the same room as the hackers. And both of their initial response was to yell at me. Which I think helped create empathy, because now they had a common bond. Both of them hated me. And then they found other things that they had in common, which is, we all do really want to end up in the same place of having better security. And once you can have everyone come to the table and admit that, or, you know what, they don't even have to admit it. You just have to get them to claim it. And then you assume that what they said in good faith, they actually said in good faith, and said, well, of course you want to do this, right? Well, we said it, we have to. And so now you're all heading in the same direction. And from then, it's hard work to find compromises. No one's going to get everything they want. And the trick is to help everyone understand that moving forward is better than not moving forward. And that's where it's really good for me to have regulators and to have Congress, because I get to say, for this issue we're talking about, whether it's botnets or IoT security or vulnerability disclosure, come talk in this room and we'll find voluntary solutions that work for most of us. Because if we don't, someone with a big stick is going to come asking questions. And that means that I can say, hey, listen, lobbyist, send me your engineer now, because otherwise you're going to have to explain to your vice president or your CEO why they're talking to Jessica's committee. So there is a lot of really powerful use in collaboration here.
I'm going to remember to turn my microphone back on. There we go. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack from these guys, because I think, one, all of their points are incredibly well made. Like I think I said at the beginning of this, I rely pretty heavily on what each of them has done. When we started doing the committee's coordinated disclosure work, the first thing I did, or maybe it was the fifth, it was near the top, was call Allan and say, hey, Allan, I don't want to duplicate what you're doing. Let's make sure we're working together on this. But I think the way that my relationship, and therefore my committee's relationship with the research community has evolved was, I just got frustrated. I came to Congress 4 years ago. I started out pretty much answering mail, answering phones, and then because I had a big tech background, computer science and mathematics, I kind of worked my way up from there. But when I actually started to get into the meat of the policy issues, what I realized is that Congress's big power when we come to start looking at different policy issues is to call other people. We call other experts. And we say, hey, we're relatively clueless on this because nobody really expects Congress to be the expert. Tell us what we should do. So we'd have an auto cybersecurity issue. And the advice that I would get from folks on my committee who'd been there for longer than I did was, okay, call this trade association and ask this trade association what you should do. Or call this company and ask this company what you think you should do. And I started off and I do that. I'd call the company, I'd call the trade association, I'd say, hey, we're looking at this issue, this is something that we see, what should we do about it? The difference, if I may sound a little bit arrogant for a minute, between me and your usual congressional staffer is that I have a technical background and most people on the Hill don't. So then when the trade association or the company would say, this is what we think you should do, I'd be like, that doesn't make any technical sense. And so I'd start asking, like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Because, if you do this, then the technology is going to do X. And their policies just kind of stopped making sense. And so I'm gonna have to call them out because there's no way to avoid it. I got really lucky in 2015. And Josh Corman was introduced to me on an issue that really we shouldn't even have met about. There was no reason for him to be talking to my committee, but he did anyway. And what ended up happening is that I was like, wait a minute, this guy knows tech and he knows policy. And what ended up happening is that every time I had an issue, I would essentially say, hey, I need a car expert. All right, well, here's 5 people. I need a medical device people. All right, well, here's another 5. I need somebody else. And so once I started talking to people who had their guts in the actual technology, I started to get much better suggestions. They weren't necessarily politically savvy. I'd get some options of, hey, this is what we think the policy should be. They're like, okay, but I'm never going to be able to do that. But what ended up becoming the way that me and the security research community have kind of evolved to work is, you tell me what you think the no politics involved solution to this problem should be. I will take my political knowledge, we will combine the two, and we will get to a policy that is technologically smart and politically feasible. And then that is the way that we'll move forward. So, that has kind of been my evolution of working with the research community, and it's been immensely valuable for me and my committee.
As people who have gone through this journey of being not harding hackers and then you're hard hackers, you've had to, through that process, have some moment of enlightenment when you're like, oh, I know what I should do. I should talk to those guys and ladies. I wonder if you've also seen that happen to a number of people around you. Suzanne, I remember one particular instance where we were having a conversation with some of your folks and some of our folks, and we had to stop the conversation and say, wait a minute, do you guys even know what coordinated vulnerability disclosure is? Before we go to this next hurdle, do you have the primitives? Do you know why researchers research? And so I wonder if you could each individually talk about what some of those triggers have been that you've seen around you, and what has been some of the biggest maybe indicators that someone is ready to flip from being a regular Fed to a Fed that hearts hackers.
I, in some ways, was quite lucky because I came from the research community more on the academic side, but I had been going to Usenix, I had been going to Oakland, I'd been going to a lot of crypto conferences, and there it wasn't just purely straight academics. There were a lot of people who just had been thinking about this and wore lots of black and had fun hair. Right? We have that in that world. So for me, the actual hurdle was something close to what Jessica had to say, which is getting over the idea that we don't need the whole solution from people, right? Clearly, when looking for expertise from the lobbyists, they don't have the whole solution, but they're good at packaging what they have as here's a clear solution. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful for me is to learn how to frame what I'm doing in a way that makes it clear what is the input we're looking for. Whether it is sometimes that's we're thinking about that, X is this dumb idea, to the world is not going to look like what you'd like it to look like. It's a shame, but you don't get a pony either. And we're going to, at least with what's in front of us, make marginal change and communicating on that side. But there is something else that I do want to say, which is I have had the privilege of introducing some of my colleagues to the research community. And there's something fantastic. They love you. You're exotic. You're different and new. The first time I got to introduce a political appointee to schedule a meeting with someone in a utility kilt, she talked about it for weeks. So don't be afraid of that. The challenge we're going to have is understanding what they're looking for. And that's part of what we have to learn as people who are trying to build that bridge on both sides. And I think that's what's so incredible about the cavalry community is they're helpful at saying, all right, we all know that we should be going here, but that involves taking a road that is best understood by going a couple of mileposts that the folks in Washington are familiar with. And so mutual reframing is going to be very, very helpful. And policy is a game that everyone can play, but you actually have to know a little bit about the rules before you can jump straight in. And so on one hand, I want to say, yes, get engaged, don't be shy. And I'm sure we will all talk towards the end of the panel about how to get engaged. But it also is really important to talk to some folks who've been thinking about this issue for a while, or at least a little bit, so that you're empowered with how to make your message come through.
So I want to jump in right there and turn my microphone on. I want to jump in right there because I just had a visual image when you were talking. And it was...
it wasn't me in a utility kilt, was it?
It was not, no. Although, yeah. Cannot be unimagined. But, I travel a fair bit to other countries and I see a lot of people who speak different languages. And if you ever go in and watch two kids who speak totally different languages trying to figure out how to play with each other, they manage to figure it out. And it may take some effort, but they both know they want to play. They know that, they need to play with each other. And so they figure out some common language to frame and build rules of a game. And it seems like there's some of that goes on when security researchers and hackers meet feds. They speak different languages. Maybe they look a little bit funny to each other. They have different cultures and backgrounds and ways of going about things, but they still find a way to engage in a common activity together. So that was a pretty cool image that popped into my head, and I wanted to leave everyone else with it. Sure. So speaking of language, I'm being coached from the side here. We ran into, when we first started talking to government people, Josh and myself, we would talk about CVEs and known CVEs, meaning the common vulnerabilities and exchange common vulnerabilities and exposures. And that's fairly table stakes for anyone probably in this room. A lot of the technical people just know what that is. That's a fundamental part of what it is to talk about security vulnerabilities. And so we were saying these in policy circles for a long, long time, many months, and talking about things like Junaid Hussain, who radicalized, went to Syria, and we killed him in a drone strike, and that he could use a known CVE to take down a hospital. Well, one of the things we didn't realize is that that's a word that means something different to other people. So in policy space and in international relations, CVE means countering violent extremism. So when you talk about CVEs, something that's fundamentally part of our lexicon, to them, it clashes with something that's fundamentally part of the international relations lexicon. So we talk about known CVEs taking down a hospital. There is an overlap there. And so it kind of makes sense, but in a way that makes us seem dumb. But once we broke through that, we realized that we were speaking this different language. So we had to change the way we spoke in order to accommodate some of the different taxonomies that were used in different parts of government, international relations, conversations with our peers abroad. So that was a realization we had. Throwing the question back to the panel, what are some of the things that look like precursors to enlightenment, or some of the things that would trigger enlightenment in someone in government to turn them into a Fed who hearts hackers?
So for me, I don't think that I can recall a specific or a single specific like aha moment, because I think that this has been incremental over time, and it comes back to really having the opportunity to meet individual researchers, to have that kind of really, almost like a heart-to-heart communication and dialogue, understanding the motivations that different individuals are bringing to the work that they do and why it's so important to this researcher or this person to do what they're doing. Just getting to that really kind of common understanding of why you do what you do and what your aspiration is, what your desired outcome is, becomes so important for me and for my team in order to be able to build that kind of bridge, and to also not only build the bridge between us at the FDA and the researcher or researchers, but to broaden that out and to really act as ambassadors, if you will, towards the other parts of the community, whether it's the medical device manufacturers that are involved, individual manufacturers, the trade organizations, as well as the healthcare organizations. And let me bring another group into the fold here, which we've been doing a lot more work with now as well, which is the clinicians themselves, the healthcare practitioners, and understanding for that particular group individuals like myself who may not have that same level of understanding of awareness as to some of the challenges and the concerns around security of devices or security within the healthcare system, because of how their education and their training has been framed in the past. So being able to speak this common language, so much of this does come down to communicating. But for me, a lot of it comes back to not being the one talking, but rather being the one listening and really eliciting exactly what it is that is getting to the researcher where they are so very, very passionate about what it is that they're doing. I've learned a lot from each and every encounter that I've had with different individuals, and I think it just enriches our ability to do the work that we're doing, knowing the unique elements that different researchers are bringing with them to the work that they're doing.
Yeah, so it sounds like for you, one of the things that leads to the enlightenment is seeing that security researchers are super excited about doing this. It's not that they're out for necessarily one motivation or another, but they all bring a passion to it and a drive to get to an end goal that might be the same as your end goal.
And yes, and by extension, what that does is when we understand that, that allows us to be, in some regards, the translators, if you will, when we talk to manufacturers who might be impacted, who might see a researcher purely as that adversary and, will vilify or demonize a researcher. And that allows us the opportunity to really reframe that conversation.
Jessica.
Yeah, so actually you just reminded me of a really special part of Congress, for example, because, we've run into a couple of issues with researchers and with manufacturers where the researcher has made some kind of claim and the manufacturer has counterclaimed, and it becomes this big battle. And I would use the terminology shield. We do sometimes become the translator between those two things, but we have also served, my committee has served as the shield between the two parties, essentially saying, we're not going to let the manufacturer go after the researcher, and we need to make sure that the researcher understands the constraints that the manufacturer is operating under, and protecting them both from the situation and maybe some of their worst instincts. There's that, and I think the other thing for us, and I actually do want to mention this because it's important, and it's happened to come up in our work. When people think of Congress, I think a lot of the times they don't think of it as a positive connotation. But we've had a couple of incidents recently where we've had folks who want to tell us things. They want to say, we're aware of a vulnerability, or we're aware of some kind of situation that's happening. And this is my offer to you in this room, because I think it is important to mention. There's something called speech and debate in Congress, which is that if you tell us something, you have told us. There's no way that somebody can force us to tell what that is. So there is a really important, I think, legal protection that we as Congress can offer in situations like this, where we can be, as contrary as it sounds, we can be a very good ally if folks are concerned about that kinds of things, and that gives us a really good ability to what I think of as be a good partner with these kinds of situations. Because for us, the goal is to get to the best outcome as quickly as possible, and sometimes that means being the person who sits in the middle and helps the situation evolve as quickly as possible. So I guess that would be mine.
Okay.
Bob, can I plug some of the work that we're doing at NTIA?
Please plug some of the work you're doing at NTIA. I thought you'd never ask.
But Allan, what can we do? There's a lot of stuff going on, and Suzanne and Jessica will talk a lot about much bigger, higher stakes things that they're doing. But at NTI, we have a couple of things where we can still use a lot of help. We have ongoing initiatives on IoT and another one on botnets. So IoT is probably the worst bucket to describe a mess of technology and policy issues since we got saddled with the term cybersecurity. Right? They're both horrible buckets, but we're stuck with them. So we can rage against them, or we can just get used to it. And the challenge when people talk about IoT security is it often is, the problem is these things are built without security in mind. So the solution is to build them securely, secure by design. Well, gosh, why didn't anyone think of that? We've been doing it wrong. It's a little like saying, excuse me, do you know where I am? Why, yes, you're lost. It's not wrong, it's just not actionable. It can't help us move forward. And so what we wanted to do was find a way to make some progress in the IoT security discussion. And we said, well, let's talk about a particular aspect of security that's important, given that everything's going to have some flaws. Let's talk about updatability. Let's talk about patching. And the Cavalry has been very active in this discussion. We've been doing this for about 7 or 8 months now. Different work streams focusing on both the technology side and the policy side, saying, because we think about markets, they have two sides, supply and demand. So let's figure out how we can empower consumers to know what to look for. There's a working group that is saying, hey, what is, again, voluntary guidance that we think we can have manufacturers say, when you're buying something, what should you look for? What should this say about patching? Patching, for those of you who know about firmware over the air and things like that, very big, messy issue. So this group is trying to distill it down to a small number of things that consumers can look for. And Bo in particular was incredibly useful in not just helping address that issue, but being the thumb on the scale of security, because there were a lot of lawyers in Washington that wanted to sort of water it down. And having the security community actually advocate for security has been very, very important. And at the same time, we're also, at the flip side, thinking about, okay, well, when we actually talk about an update, what can we say about the features of an update so that we're not introducing new vulnerabilities, things like that. So if you're interested in IoT updatability, please let me know, reach out. And we're going to be continuing thinking about carving up this issue using this voluntary tool. And just a quick note on the voluntary tool and working with stakeholders. The trick is to understand the leverage and what people's incentives are. Because as much as we hate the super cheap stuff that comes over by the container load, from these fly-by-night operations that are built without any security in mind because they're terrible for security. You know who really hates super cheap electronics? People who sell expensive electronics. And so while they may not be really excited about broader security standards, we've been able to make a lot of progress just by saying, hey, listen, it's in your interest to raise the overall expectation of security because it's going to help your market. So that's the kind of thinking that we need in this approach. And the final plug I'll make is there's an executive order that came out that's thinking about botnets. Think of this as the administration response to Mirai, about 6 months too late. It's a new administration, so it's not their fault. They weren't in charge at the time. We're quite lucky we were given a whole year to think about this because unlike the other aspects of this executive order, which focused on government finding the solution, we are charged by the White House to identify and promote stakeholder action. So we need your help thinking about botnets as an ecosystem perspective, thinking about it at the endpoints, the IoT space, thinking about the networks, thinking about users, thinking about infrastructure. There are many pieces we all need to think about how to work together. So if you have thoughts on that front about how we can address distributed automated attacks and take it back down to the background level risk that it was circa 2015, we're not trying to eliminate everything. We're just trying to make it the casual part of the internet ecosystem. So those are my 2 plugs.
Yeah, and one thing to kind of add on to that is in talking with some people around DC about the botnet issue, one of the things that they said that they had heard before they talked to security researchers is that, well, the solution to botnets should just be to use the network and forget about the endpoint. You can never secure the endpoint, just use the network. And that worked for the people making cheap devices because they didn't want to add security. That worked for some of the ISPs because they wanted to have a legitimate excuse to break net neutrality. That worked for a lot of people, and it worked for security vendors because then they could sell stuff to go on the network. And oppressive regimes. Yeah, it was great for oppressive regimes, that one. But then after talking to security researchers and hackers and some of the people in this room, what they quickly realized is that it wasn't just should we put something on the network or use the network? It was, how do we reform the ecosystem so that it's better and more resilient against this type of thing, not just in the short term, what can we do tomorrow, but also in the longer term, how do we build the incentives to realign things? And Allan, you set me up perfectly for my next question, which was going to be, assuming that folks here in the room and on video are bought into the idea that they want to also be one of the hackers that you heart, how would they best go about doing that? What can they do to make them more accessible and available, to have the right posture, and to help equip you to go and address some of the things where you are aligned with them in the right direction? And maybe we'll start with either Jessica or Suzanne, since you already put in your pitch.
Sure. So certainly, from FDA's perspective, a few points. Number one, we always have an open door policy with regard to security researchers reaching out to us, reaching out to our team with respect to vulnerabilities or research that they're doing, whether or not one is having a good response in terms of interactions with a manufacturer, with any other organization. That's something that people should feel entirely comfortable with. Ideally, it's great if the identifiers of vulnerabilities, the security researchers are able to go directly to the manufacturer of the medical device and to have that dialogue, that identification of what their research has discovered with the manufacturer. That does bring us back to the importance of coordinated disclosure and having a disclosure policy. And that's why that becomes so fundamental to the guidance that we issued back last December. And I want to also commend and put in a plug here for Allan's amazing work at NTIA on the coordinated disclosure front, because I think that it exemplifies really the ability for industry whether one is at the very immature level or whether one's more sophisticated, to find that space in terms of where one is at in that kind of model of maturation, to develop the kind of templates and disclosure policy that's going to work for that organization and that can allow that organization to grow as well as it becomes more and more sophisticated with respect to and more comfortable with dealing with researchers coming forward with information and having a disclosure policy, a place and a process by which the vulnerability information can be taken in and can be appropriately handled. So going back to your question, I think that manufacture absolutely is the best place to start. Sometimes if the manufacturer, if that's not working for whatever reason, one can always come to the FDA. One doesn't have to wait, for that matter to come to the FDA. And the other organization that we work with, that we coordinate very closely with, is ICS-CERT. ICS-CERT's involvement in the medical device space has been just kind of expanding more and more with respect to their comfort level as well. And so we have a good rapport, a good working relationship with ICS-CERT and with manufacturers and the researchers that enable us to have a good dialogue back and forth and enable manufacturers to be more expedient in dealing with the vulnerabilities that have been identified and doing the appropriate assessment for the impact and then taking the necessary steps in order to address what the vulnerability is.
Great. Well, I think I would have sort of several categories. The first one for how to influence government in a technology smart way is join government. So, I mean, it sounds trite, but it's really the best thing that you can do if you want to really influence the way that decisions are being made or what those decisions are. The best thing that you can do is just get directly involved. I would love to have additional tech smart backup in Congress. There's one other person within the House of Representatives, staff at the House of Representatives, who I think of who has a computer science background. He and I are constantly talking about the fact that there's only two of us. That working with Allan or going to work for Suzanne or going to work for any of these agencies. I mean, the government is in such desperate need of tech smart people that please come. I mean, I'll be fully honest, you're not going to make nearly as much money as you could other places. But I think that the value you could have and the influence that you can have is really hard to overstate. I mean, to be frank about it, I'm 26 and I get to influence cybersecurity policy for one of the most powerful committees in the United States government. So, that's one way of looking at it. The other way that I would look at it is sort of what I was hitting on before with bringing up sort of the congressional protections that one is afforded when somebody talks to us. My email inbox, my phone, my door are open. If you have an issue that you think is problematic and that you think needs addressing, talk to us. Talk to somebody in government and tell us that you think it's an issue. We need to be aware, and we're not always going to be aware. We don't see the same things that you do. We don't understand them in the same way that you do. And so we sometimes need that additional help of, hey, this is the problem. This is what, I think you should do about it. And this is how. It's very difficult to overstate the value of that for us. And I think, now we kind of look at coordinated disclosure, or maybe I'll just say it from my perspective, look at coordinated disclosure as a done deal. I mean, it's just such an expectation now that, if you don't have it, that's something that regulators and investigators get very curious about these days. But there was a time, and it was only 2 or 3 years ago, where that was not at all the case. And so, we needed security researchers making a huge fuss about, we found a vulnerability in a pacemaker, we found a vulnerability in a car, we found a vulnerability in XYZ, because we wouldn't know otherwise. And that's still true today. Maybe not as true as it was in past years, and maybe it's not as true in issues with coordinated disclosure, but in other areas, we still need to know. So contact us directly and let us know these things because they're so important.
I think I know what you're both about to say, which is, as Jessica said, if you want to really influence change, go into government. And I think both Suzanne and Allan would love to have you, assuming that they can hire smart people. There's also things like, and I don't know if Travis is here, but techcongress.io is a way that smart tech people can do a fellowship and a rotation in a congressional office, which is a pretty cool thing. You go in for a year and you're able to help shape and advise policy. And there's also many other ways to engage and get involved, such as joining a think tank, as Josh and I did. And none of these things will have the same, there'll be different trade-offs with private sector. You won't have as good a paycheck, but you'll be able to make the world a better place in a way that affects millions and millions of people and potentially billions of people around the world.
So I want to underscore something that Jessica said, which is fantastic, which is we won on vulnerability disclosure, right? 2 years, even less than 2 years, right? 2 years ago, this was an issue that was weird in Washington. Mm-hmm. It was incredibly specialized. Most people had not heard of it. And now it's boring. And the ultimate goal for everything we do is to make it boring. The other thing I'm going to do is that since we are in the cavalry track, I want to underscore how important the cavalry is for me. Mm-hmm. Washington has special interests, and I don't mean the damn those special interests. I mean, it's really useful when I need to know, what does the communication sector, what's the difference between how the cable industry thinks about this versus the telecoms, right? It's useful for me to know that. And there are trade groups for that. Privacy has great constituency in Washington. I can talk to many different flavors of privacy advocates. There had never been an advocacy for security. The notion that the stuff we use, we should be able to trust. And that is an incredibly important voice that needs to be at the table because all the other voices are already at the table. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been a learning process for the cavalry to figure out how to approach these discussions in a way that's productive. It's been a learning process for me joining government, right? Nothing comes naturally. This is going to be a little slow. I'll give you a hint. The Register probably isn't the best source of news for what's going on in Washington. Right? You need to actually understand what's going on. Right? The perspectives you get from certain advocacy groups may not help you understand the full perspective. But having that voice has been really useful. And I think it's made a real difference. So for those of you who have been a part of this, thank you. And I think there are still so much work to do in Washington and around the world. This is something that needs to be, security is not an American issue, despite what certain parts of the US government think sometimes. And we need to make progress on that globally.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to echo all those wonderful remarks that you made. The relationship that we enjoy with Am The Cavalry has been, it's sort of beyond words in terms of my being able to tell you both and everyone else who's been involved how important it has been in terms of where we've been able to get to and where we expect to be going. But I do just want to also do a little bit of a reality check with respect to coordinated disclosure. Okay, we believe that it is critical, that it is really important in the medical device space. It's slow going in terms of adoption with medical device manufacturers. And so some of what we need to be thinking about over the next 12 months is what are those impediments and how do we get to a better, greater adoption. Two of the manufacturers who are champions of coordinated disclosure are in the room with us right now, but we're preaching to the choir. And we need to be, by next year, in a much better place where it's not the minority of manufacturers who are involved in coordinated disclosure, but many, many more.
Yeah, and we are out of time. We don't have time for questions, but a lot of us will be here, all week. But one thing I do want to ask is if you are a Fed or associated with a government, whether it's U.S. government or other government, and you want to engage more with the hacker community, maybe just raise your hand so the others can see you. And so folks can come up to you and talk to you later. There's more than that in the room, I assure you. They're just not always outing themselves. But all right, with that, thank you very much for attending. I think we've got a break up next, and we'll see you back here for our healthcare discussion at 5. Thank you.